Welcome to On the Other Hand, a series of short videos based on chapters of Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson. The first episode covers Hazlitt's underlying insight about economic policy, and with me to discuss it is David Seymour from the Frontier Center for Public Policy. David, Economics in One Lesson is over 60 years old, so why does it still matter?
Well, it still matters because its principles are very simple, but they have surprising consequences when applied to almost any policy area. And Hazlitt's insights can take a policy like cash for clunkers, where governments pay people to scrap their old cars, from sounding like the cleverest idea ever to the silliest idea ever, just by showing the hidden consequences of the policy.
Okay, so who was Henry Hazlitt and what exactly is his key insight?
Well, Hazlitt reported on business for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal for most of the first half of the last century. And he also wrote several books on economics. I suspect that Economics in One Lesson as a book was a kind of catharsis for him because he wanted to explain all the things he thought people got wrong with economics. And the insight itself is very easy. All it says is that when you consider the effects of an economic policy, you have to consider the effects on all groups and the effects in the long run, rather than just consider some groups in the short run.
But didn't John Maynard Keynes say, in the long run, we're all dead?
Well, yeah, and the short answer is that most of us have children, but more seriously, the long run in economics is not a particular length of time, like 6 months or 2 weeks or anything like that. It's just the time that it takes for people to react to an initial change. So let's say there's a sudden increase in demand for bread, and that pushes up the price of bread in the short run. Suppliers then respond to the shortage and produce more bread, and the price comes back down, so there's no long run change in the price. Now, if you focus only on the short run, you miss that second half of the story. But when it comes to economics, people have an overwhelming tendency to focus only on the short-term impact and only on the impact for some groups.
What would be a modern example of an economic policy where people focused only on the primary effects and ignored the secondary ones?
Well, cash for clunkers is just such a great example. If you have a look at the short-term impacts for some people, it sounds too good to be true. Struggling car companies get new business, some people get new cars, the environment gets newer, more efficient cars replacing older ones.
But you're going to say it's too good to be true?
Yeah, pretty much. And that's because you have to take into account the long-run effects on all people, not just the short-term effects on car factories and the people who get paid for their clunkers. So who are these other people? Well, first of all, you have to look at low-income people who might want to buy a clunker. Now, they find the government is now bidding against them for the supply of old cars, and that pushes up the price, so they're actually worse off. Then you've got to think of people who don't actually work for car companies. Now, there might be more jobs for people who do work in car companies, but when the government takes money and it spends it on a program like Cash for Clunkers, taxpayers can no longer spend that money on anything else, so jobs have to be lost somewhere else.
But that still leaves the environment.
Well, even then, scrapping cars earlier than usual means more cars have to be built. In fact, of course, that was the original reason for this whole policy. But manufacturing cars is not exactly what you call an environmentally friendly process, so even that advantage backfires. Cash for clunkers sounds so good at first, but as soon as you think about long-term effects and other people, it turns out to be pointless at best and really stupid at worst.
I find it hard to believe that so many people are getting this so wrong. How do you know that economic policy making is really so myopic?
Well, there are some dynamics in economic policy debates that set them apart from debates about, say, chemistry or physics. If you lose an argument about physics, it might be humiliating, but it generally doesn't make you poorer. At the end of the day, there's a common interest that we all have in knowing the truth about those subjects. In economics, on the other hand, people often have opposing interests. So if you worked for Chrysler or GM, for example, you might be biased in favor of cash for clunkers. But if you worked in the tourism industry and saw people buying cars instead of holidays as a result of cash for clunkers, then you might be biased the other way. Another way you could put it, there's an old saying, a man will make himself believe most anything if his salary depends on it.
It's a very cynical view of human nature then. People ignore the secondary effects because they're selfish.
Well, perhaps, but people are no less selfish as voters or as politicians than they are normally. And there's another simple fact too that means short-term effects on some groups get more attention, and that is that people telling the simplest story tend to win debates. In our Cash for Clunkers example, the benefits are easy to explain. The story of who will pay for those benefits and when they'll pay is harder to explain, because the costs of government policies are usually spread out over many people and indirect, just like the competition for clunkers amongst low-income buyers. Whereas politicians, on the other hand, have an incentive to emphasize the benefits of their policies. And it's not that politicians do that because they're immoral, it's just that if a politician doesn't do that, others will.
So to sum up, the lesson is about three things. The long-run effects of a policy on all groups are more important than the effects on some groups in the short run. Economic truth is more likely to be a victim of vested interests than is truth in any other field. Long-run effects on all groups are usually more complex than the short-run effects on some groups.
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis, thanks.
This was the first episode of On the Other Hand. Each subsequent episode will apply the basic lesson from Economics in One Lesson to an economic policy question. Upcoming policy issues include rent control, bailing out industries, the effect of technology on employment, the role of unions, and the economic costs of war. Until then.